Welcome to this talk on marriage in Elizabethan England. Today we're going to be thinking about what marriage was actually like for noblewomen during this period, what was expected of them, and what did a successful marriage look like. Also, what happened when a marriage broke down. Before we begin, let's take a moment to check that we're all on the same page with the vocabulary that I'll be using today. The Elizabethan period, the time when England was ruled by Elizabeth I, was from 1558 until 1603. A noblewoman was a woman who belonged to the highest social class in society, and the terms noble and elite women are used here interchangeably. Titles could include duchess, marchioness, countess, viscountess, baroness, princess, lady and dame. And contemporary means of the time. For example, a contemporary text here would be a book written during the Elizabethan period. And I might mention conduct literature, which is a book or books which advised on behaviour and morals. So let's get started. In Elizabethan England, daughters born to elite families were raised with the ambition of becoming wives. The advancement of the daughter and her family were key factors in the negotiations of unions, and therefore the objectives were to produce heirs, consolidate wealth, and create social and political alliances. With convents closed due to the Reformation and universities unavailable to them, the only alternative to marriage for women was celibacy, a fate which was often worse than an unpleasant marriage. 94% of noblemen's daughters married at least once during this period, and historians have finally begun to question how the writing of history would be transformed if the experiences of such women were included. While there's a temptation to think about their lives through modern views on gender and equality, the nature of their relationships were markedly different in Elizabethan England to today. Because of this, it's crucial to have an understanding of the patriarchal society in which they inhabited. Patriarchy, or the institutionalised male dominance over women, was a significant feature of English Elizabethan society. It was upheld by subordination and inferiority. Subordination, which originated from God's punishment of Eve, was encouraged by conduct literature that described the ways in which a wife should demonstrate her obedience. Inferiority often involved depicting a wife as physically, mentally and emotionally lesser or a weaker vessel, a term which originated with the translation of the New Testament in 1526 and became commonly used throughout the 16th century. It's interesting to consider how readily women were seen as inferior while there was a woman on the throne. While Elizabeth I may not have actively sought to challenge these ideas, her very existence as an anointed queen created a complicated connection between gender, marriage and power, and her reluctance to marry threatened the very nature of patriarchy. It's therefore been suggested that conduct literature was produced in order to retain the control of women and bolster the grip of patriarchy within the home. I'll be referring to 4 key women throughout this talk, and I've chosen them particularly because they all have excellent resources attributed to them that are fairly easy to access if you wanted to research them further. First up, we have Bess of Hardwicke, or Elizabeth Cavendish, later Elizabeth Talbot. She's more often known as Bess of Hardwicke, though, of Hardwicke Hall, Derbyshire, and she was a notable figure of Elizabethan English society. She was a friend of Elizabeth I, and her husband was jailer to Mary, Queen of Scots. By a series of 4 well-made marriages, she had 8 children and rose to the highest levels of English nobility and became enormously wealthy. Her 4th marriage made her the Countess of Shrewsbury. Letters to and from her are an amazing resource, and they're available free online. Barbara Sidney was a Welsh heiress and the first wife of Robert Sidney, who was the first Earl of Leicester. They had 11 children together. Sidney's letters to Barbara, written when he was away from home on official business, have been published in a book and contain information about household details and news of major events. Sadly, her letters to him have not survived, but we're still able to infer a great deal about their correspondence to each other. Lady Margaret Hoby was an heiress who had 3 marriages but no children. Her first marriage was to Walter Devereux, who was the son of Robert Devereux, a favourite of the Queen. Her last marriage was to Sir Thomas Hoby, and she produced the earliest known diary in English, and this is available to buy as a book. Lastly, we have Lady Grace Mildmay. She was an English noblewoman, and like many noblewomen, was a medical practitioner. Her autobiography is one of the earliest existing of an English woman. She married Sir Anthony Mildmay and had 1 daughter, but it was a very unhappy marriage. Her writings include memoirs, medical papers, and devotional meditations. I'm also going to mention these texts. I won't go into a huge amount of detail about them here, but just to give you a really brief overview. So the first one is the Golden Book of Christian Matrimony by Heinrich Bullinger, written in 1543. This book is a treatise about marriage and the Christian state of wedlock, and it gives advice and insights for married people or those that wanted to be married. Then we have a book called A Crystal Glass for a Christian Woman. This was by Philip Stubbs. He was a vigorous Puritan pamphleteer and propagandist. His Anatomy of Abuses, which was his most popular work, consisted of an attack on English life. But this Crystal Glass for Christian Women was a biographical account of his wife, a very idolised one, and he depicts her as an even narrower Puritan than he was himself. Obviously, there's various versions of the Bible, so when I reference the Bible here, I'm going to be talking about the Bishop's Bible, which was produced around that time, 1568. It was produced under the authority of the Church of England, and then it was revised in 1572 and 1602, and it was the base text for the King James Version. And then finally, I will be mentioning a particular homily, which was a homily of a state of matrimony written in either 1563 or 1571. This was the 18th of 21 homilies written for the second book, possibly by Matthew Parker, Elizabeth's Archbishop of Canterbury, and these would have been read regularly in churches. Expectations of a nobleman's wife. In the Elizabethan hierarchy, husbands were unquestionably superior to their wives. A married woman's limitations were defined by law and medicine. A husband had full rights over her property, and she was considered to be physically, mentally, and emotionally inferior, requiring discipline, direction, and protection from her husband. A married couple were considered to be one person, and although this suggests an equal partnership, the Bible taught that Eve was made from Adam's rib, not his head, and therefore a wife was there not to influence, but to simply become an inferior aspect of her husband. The inferiority of a wife was widely accepted, and this was expected to be reflected in her character by her subservience and her attempts to regulate her weaker emotions. A wife was deemed a fragile creature, incapable of reason or decision. Her body was unpredictable, lustful and sinful, and according to some Elizabethans, she didn't even have a soul. Despite this, the expectations placed on elite women were high. In terms of her demeanour, numerous responsibilities within the home and estate, often absorbing a husband's duties in his absence. In short, while she was deemed pretty and capable, she was given a lot of responsibility. Heinrich Bullinger asked, "What is a rich woman without godly qualities than an ass laden with a great multitude of treasure?" And thus, this was an attitude which endured throughout the Elizabethan period. So it's all very good and well to be rich, but you need a personality with it. Puritanism also stressed the importance of personal qualities over wealth when selecting a wife. This may have been because a woman's demeanour and reputation reflected directly on her husband. An unvirtuous wife casted doubt on their spouse's ability to govern. In the homily of state of matrimony, which was read frequently in churches, it outlined the desirable qualities of a wife as being chastity, submissiveness, virtue, charity, tolerance, and silence. Although these qualities were not desirable only for noble women, aristocratic women may have been under particular scrutiny. While this extensive collection of virtues appears ambitious, there is evidence that wives did aspire to it. For example, Margaret Hoby frequently wrote about looking after others and spending large amounts of time in silent reflection, and Grace Mildmay was told by her mother-in-law to be a virtuous woman, dutiful to her husband in all chastity, obedience, love and fear. But being virtuous was made up of several aspects. An honest wife, for example, was described as a great honour by Bollinger, and in contrast he described dishonesty as being a corruption to the husband's bones. Silence was also greatly valued, and references were often made to Sarah, the wife of Abraham, who kept herself silent in all things. Stubbs praised his wife, who obeyed the commandment of the apostle, who biddeth women to be silent. A wife's prattling tongue was condemned and frequently linked with infidelity, due to the belief that a torrent of speech suggested a husband could not control his wife. So there's a suggestion that if a husband can't control his wife's tongue, then he probably can't control what else she's up to either. A wife was expected to be a paragon of virtue and guard her chastity in the same way she might guard her husband's property. The book A Godly Form of Household Government, for example, said that a wife is known as a housewife, not a street wife, and encouraged women to remain chaste and at home. The depiction of women as lustful due to their lesser heat could suggest why chastity was deemed as requiring control if the patriarchal society were to continue to function. One example that faithfulness was deemed desirable is demonstrated by the way Bess of Hardwick closed her letters to her husband with phrases such as "your humble wife, most faithful," and "your obedient, faithful wife." The Elizabethans had behaviour codes to enforce submissiveness with the upper classes. Submission in this instant can be described as obedience and reverence. Reverence referred to words and behaviour, and it was expected that wives would demonstrate their subservience through obedient behaviour and the way they addressed their husbands. Husband was defined by the Elizabethan theologian William Perkins as he that hath authority over the wife. Further, humanist Sir Thomas Smith argued that God created men as stronger and more intelligent than women to compel obedience through force or wit. Obedience was considered to be the natural state of the wife, and that God, desiring this, equipped husbands with the means to enforce it. Catherine Stubbs, who, according to her husband, would never contrary him in anything, offered sage advice with humility and submission. Grace Mildmay also wrote that had she displayed disobedience, God himself would have forsaken me, and all good friends would have turned against me, indicating obedience was a societally desired norm. Evidence that wives accepted this inferior status can be found via the way they addressed their husbands in letters. Bess of Hardwick, for example, often wrote "my lord, my husband," or softer versions such as "my own good lord" when addressing George Talbot. While this was a marriage that arguably lacked in emotional warmth, these greetings did at least demonstrate reverence and respect. Similarly, Grace Mildmay referred to Anthony Mildmay as "my dear husband," despite the fact strains existed between them. It can't be assumed that elite women conformed to this deferential model. It has been argued that only around 1/4 of letters written by wives were formal in this way. A wife was expected to be industrious, undertaking many responsibilities within the home. The Bible commanded women to study to be quiet and do your own business and to work with your own hands as we commanded you. Women were not only expected to simply keep busy, but to utilise their talents. They shouldn't only be ornaments for their husbands, but demonstrate their virtue through work and activity. This is particularly evident in Margaret Hoby's diary, where her time is divided between household undertakings and spiritual reflection. Elite women were expected to be capable of running a home, and the duties undertaken by Barbara Sidney, for example, such as administration of the household and dealing with finances, have been described as typical for those of an early modern woman of her status. In letters from Barbara's husband, Robert Sidney, there's evidence of her duties. For example, he wrote, "I send you the parcels you gave order to buy," demonstrating a proactiveness in her organisation and her authority over purchases. Robert Sidney also referred to the household as "your house," suggesting the responsibility of it fell to his wife. Margaret Hoby's references to household management are frequent, including details such as talking with some of the servants of household matters and making orders for the house and being busy in the kitchen. Bess of Hardwicke wrote to her husband George Talbot about domestic matters in a practical and confident manner. For example, in a letter written in their early marriage, she wrote that the wine he'd sent was unsatisfactory and complaining as though half were water and the other much worse. Building work appeared to be considered part of their role. For example, Margaret Hoby references walking to see her builders, and Bess of Hardwicke wrote requesting the services of a plasterer on her own behalf rather than that of her husband. Writing to his wife, Robert Sidney commented, "I need not send to know how my buildings go forward. I am sure you are so good a housewife, you may be trusted with them." Bess of Hardwicke and Barbara Sidney were frequently required to adopt extra responsibilities due to their husbands' long periods of absence, such as collecting rent and overseeing sales and repairs. This sense of responsibility contrasts deeply with the expectation of ineptitude expressed in contemporary literature. This mixture of responsibility and low expectation lead to comments of surprise at the freedom of elite wives expressed by foreign visitors. For example, the Swiss diarist Thomas Platter wrote in 1599 that English women had more liberty than in other lands. The men must put up with such ways and not punish them for it. Similarly, Frederick, Duke of Württemberg, said in 1592, "England is a paradise for women. They have great liberty and are almost like masters." Perhaps obedience and reverence allowed women a degree of liberty to enjoy certain freedoms, particularly when their husbands were away. The medical and theological identification of women as inferior beings has not truly represented the reality of how wives were treated or carried themselves. It's improbable that if a man truly believed his wife to be devoid of reason and intelligence, then would he really allow her to run his estate, manage his finances, and oversee building works within the home? Alternatively, perhaps these husbands were so well deferred to they didn't truly feel they were handing over control. Women such as Margaret Hoby paints a picture of a wife who was unwaveringly pious and virtuous, though she also exudes a type of independence within her writing that doesn't present as defiant but falls within the religious remit of virtuous industry. So what was a successful marriage? Marital success during this period can be difficult to determine. At a basic level, it could be argued that any marriage which endured was successful, although it's possible to extend this to incorporate some of the purposes for marriage which were outlined by both contemporary and modern writers. Christian purposes of marriage were taught as being procreation, regulation of sexual intercourse, and mutual support and comfort. Other objectives were more pragmatic, for example, the continuation of the male line, the preservation of inherited property, and the acquisition of property or political alliances. Some historians have argued that companionship and physical relationships may also have been an important aspect to marriage, and while dynastic ambition and the resources brought to the marriage were important, they didn't necessarily outweigh affection in ensuring a successful union. Other historians, however, argue for marriage as more of a business arrangement and the amassing of wealth and resources with heirs to inherit as important for success. For some in the Elizabethan period, a successful marriage was founded on emotion. For instance, the minister Henry Smith stated that a marriage which is not the joining of hearts is a marriage in name only. While it's widely held to have been an essential aspect of marriage, love actually had a number of meanings, and not all of them were desirable or considered important. Affectionate love was an advantageous or even essential element of marriage for some. Romantic or passionate love and lust were considered sinful and suspicious. Within marriage, sexual intimacy was often described in conduct literature as being honourable and essential to preventing adultery, which was becoming less tolerated during this period. It was also reasoned that marriage would prevent sex before marriage. And the Bible taught that if they cannot abstain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. And the word burn here may have had the double meaning of both desire and hell. The concept of matrimony as a way to avoid fornication combines several ideas. The idea that every man have his own wife and every woman have her own husband, or St. Paul's teaching that each spouse's body belongs to the other, and also the idea that marriages of this period were hoped to be mutually supportive units. Evidence of mutual support can be seen in the letters of Robert Sidney to his wife Barbara, where he confided in her regarding matters such as his career and the health of his relatives. He also sought to reassure her. For example, he wrote, "You need not be afraid of what you apprehend, for I shall have this money without the danger you fear." Within marriages such as theirs, where absences were long and frequent, mutual support was likely to have been especially important. The natural to and fro of letter writing lent an organic kind of mutual support in one responding to another one's concerns and problems, such as the worry for each other's safety, which is also reflected in the letters. In the case of Margaret Hoby, however, whose husband tended to be at home more frequently, the support appears somewhat one-sided, with her tending to his needs but making little comment of reciprocation. For example, she frequently referenced, "I'm keeping Mr. Hoby company," and walking with him discussing diverse things, and in small suggestions, they worked in a team-like capacity. For example, she wrote, she helped to read of the placing of the people in the church to Mr. Hoby, and that they took the horse and rode to see our farm. It's been suggested that affection within a marriage was important for its success, and Protestantism placed greater emphasis on the emotional quality of life within the home. It's also been argued that wives actually received a greater amount of affection from the husbands than the husbands did, who were expected to display tenderness, and the wives expected to display reverence. The Bible taught that men should be affectionate to their wives and that they should love their wives as their own bodies, a sentiment reflected seemingly genuinely by Bessie's husband William St. Lowe in one of his letters, and he wrote, "My own, more dearer than I am to myself." William St. Lowe also addressed Bess as my honest, sweet Chatsworth. In Robert Sidney's letters to Barbara, salutations included "my most dear Barbara, my most dearly beloved," and closing such as "your assured loving husband and the playfully affectionate farewell, my sweet wench." Examples of husbands missing their wives include St. Lowe, who wrote, "wishing myself with thyself," and another letter remarked that he would refrain from answering all the particulars in Bess's previous letter, as "God willing, I will this week be the messenger myself." Similarly, Robert Sidney wrote, "I know I shall wish you 1,000 times with me." From these examples, feelings of sadness and frustration can be deduced, which may have in turn been experienced affectionately by their spouses. But also unhappiness at the absence of each other. Does this make the marriage less successful? That probably depends on whether success is measured by happiness or money. Although arguments have been made for the importance of affection, an elite marriage during this period needed to be based on material foundations. Many historians argue that Elizabethans did not acknowledge temperament within marriage, and that the amalgamation and acquisition of land, which could provide an income, was everything. Therefore, a girl's fortune or marriage portion was a key component in marital negotiations, leaving less opportunity for a love match, and possibly less scope for her to voice her opinion. Yet, a financial match did impact positively on the wife's marital experience, in that she gained a right to support from the husband's property for the rest of her life, and a third of his land in dower after his death. If the husband died, elite women often remarried quickly, commonly within a year, and through marriage they accrued support and resources from families as they moved from one to the next. Parity of rank was important, as a wife of higher status would disrupt the natural order and impact on patriarchy. This could be extended to parity of wealth, demonstrated by tensions that arose between some couples when the wife was financially independent. Although this may not have always been the issue, in the late Elizabethan period, 32% of aristocratic men bettered themselves via marriage, such as Thomas Hoby's marriage to Margaret. Lineage was also an important factor in marriage negotiations. Heirs needed to be produced to inherit, and the failure to produce heirs was the most significant factor in the thinning of the ranks of nobility at this time. Therefore, the pressure to procreate was understandably high. It's been argued that only heirs could cement a marriage, and that having a large number of children or many expensive daughters might have been problematic. But to have no children, such in the case of Margaret and Thomas Hoby, was a greater plight and shamefully negligent. When a child was born, the choice of godparent could be used to strengthen friendships and alliances. For example, Sister Barbara Robert Sidney requested that Lord Southampton, the 3rd Earl of Southampton, who was favourite of the Queen and patron to William Shakespeare, could be godfather to their children. Through marriages of their children, parents were able to make allies in times of political uncertainty and create a network of vital friends, relations and contacts. Such matches, however, could often exclude the wishes of the children themselves and lead to discord within a marriage. For example, that of Grace to Anthony Mildmay, who'd openly wished not to marry her. And finally, dysfunctional marriage and breakdown. The elements which could cement a marriage, such as affection, procreation, and the establishment of political alliances and a combination of property, made it incredibly difficult to end the marriage, despite how dysfunctional or unhappy it may have been. It's been suggested that marital disharmony and unhappiness were more common than affection. The homily of State of Matrimony conveyed to Elizabethans that few marriages existed without chidings, brawlings, tauntings, repentings, bitter cursings, and fightings. This was a statement read frequently in church during Elizabeth's reign, and therefore suggests it was an issue that needed addressing. Elizabethan society was not a separating nor a divorcing one, and that death was virtually the only means of dissolving an unhappy union. However, while separation was uncommon, it did occur and marked the pinnacle of the dysfunctional marriage. During the marriage negotiations of substantial landowners, the couple were often given little opportunity to veto a match. Therefore, it's likely that any affection that had existed between them grew over time, as opposed to being the foundation on which it was based. When marriages were forced by family or via an abusive wardship, it often led to a loveless marriage, such as the case of Grace and Anthony Mildmay. Diaries of Elizabethan husbands often displayed concern regarding the dwindling affection within their marriages. Margaret Hoby's diary recorded no particular affection or real feeling towards or from her husband, and the instances of mutual support, such as not attending church because he was ill or keeping him company, could be evidence more of wifely obedience. The Hobys appear to have been a match of connection and honour, orchestrated in part by links with the Cecil and Cook families. There doesn't seem to have been a great deal of regard of affection for the match. Grace similarly made little reference to affection between herself and her husband during their difficult relationship. However, she wrote endearingly of her father-in-law, Walter Mildmay, for example, "I have thought to call to mind the extraordinarily love and favour of this said person towards myself." It's interesting to use Bessie's 3rd and 4th marriages as examples of the success of marriage with and without affection. William St. Lo married Bess despite her debts and having daughters to provide for, and it's likely this was a love match. In contrast, her marriage to George Talbot was purely an amalgamation of property, and while it appears he displayed affection during the early years of their marriage, it later became limited, possibly due to his poor health, leading to the breakdown of their marriage. Comparisons can be drawn from letters written by George Talbot in their early marriage, where he described having been concerned about Bessie's well-being and being revived again by your writing to me, and one written amidst their marital feuding, in which he admonishes Bess for her private and daily abuses, though both by words and actions most vehement and intolerable. During this period, there was a slow realisation that a lack of affection could lead to harmful quarrelling and impact on the family's honour and prosperity. Although parents and guardians still expected to be influential in the negotiations, affection was becoming a consideration. While an absence of affection within marriage may have been accepted, it's not always clear whether physical abuse was tolerated. Some historians have argued that husband would have felt free to administer even severe corporal punishment to his wife, with the courts upholding his right. However, tyrannical husbands were disapproved of. And in a homily of Holy Matrimony, there's an interesting stance on this. in some ways condemning the beating of wives. For example, a man should not beat his wife, for that is the greatest shame that can be. However, it also suggests that if a husband does abuse his wife, and she can endure it in silence, she would be rewarded by God, painting a picture that it's almost better to be an abused wife that copes with it than to be treated well. Most kings, including Henry VIII, had kept mistresses, and their male subjects followed his example, with the general understanding that unchastity was pardonable for a man. However, post-Reformation, adultery began to be viewed as sinful for both men and women, although in women it still bore greater consequences. If a wife committed adultery, there was a risk of an illegitimate child inheriting. This demonstrates a double standard in itself, in that until the mid-Tudor period, illegitimate children of aristocratic husbands were often provided for in wills, and therefore men would have been impacting on the inheritance. The double standard and general acceptance of polygamy amongst elite couples was essential to the success of an arranged marriage, and therefore when Puritanism, which refused to accept this tolerance towards male adultery, gained momentum in England, there began to be an increase in marital discord, with wives starting to openly object to mistresses. However, not all women objected, and it was still expected of model wives that they would turn a blind eye. Adultery could affect the honour of the extended family. An homily of the state of matrimony and the Christian state of matrimony both spoke critically of adultery amongst men and women. For example, the Christian state of matrimony said, "Why do we leave our poor wives and children at home, succorless and unprovided for?" Written in 1542, this was clearly directed at adultery among husbands. However, from the homily written in 1562, it takes a more equal approach, arguing that a good conscience might be preserved on both parts. Some Protestant clergy had begun to argue for the innocent party of adultery to be allowed to remarry. Polygamy then became illegal in 1603. There were also cases of wives being accused of adultery, and in such instances her experience of marriage and its breakdown depended very much on the support of her parents or close family. For example, Mary Kitson Darcy separated from her husband, Baron Thomas Darcy, in 1594 after he persistently accused her of infidelity, and she lived with various supportive relatives. In this case, many saw Thomas Darcy as a weak and perverse man, and this poor opinion may have lent itself to the wife's bid for support, and is unusual in its depiction of the husband as being at fault. There was an increased number of marital breakdowns in the late 16th century due to wives' objections to mistresses and tensions around money. The only real glimpse we have of discord amongst the Sidneys centres around excessive spending in the household, and the stormy relationship between Dorothy Devereux, Countess of Northumberland, and Sir Percy Perrot has been linked with tensions surrounding her financial independence. Private separations were rare in the Elizabethan period, but not unheard of. In the marriage between Bess and George Talbot, where complete breakdown to the point of separation occurred, this again seems to have stemmed from financial concerns of the husband, with George Talbot becoming incensed at Bess's spending. His estimates were often exaggerated. The experience of breakdown and separation for Bess appears to have been quite harrowing, and she made attempts to prevent the deterioration of her marriage further. For example, she wrote, "I will leave no way unsought to attain your favour, which long you have restrained from me." The wife had little voice in the situation, with parents often deciding whether separation or reconciliation was more prudent for family honour. If honour was deemed to be at risk, marital breakdown may have reached the courts or resulted in a family conclave run like a private trial. The Queen even intervened on occasion, disapproving of disharmony in marriage. For example, she insisted that George Talbot end his separation with Bess, as well as giving similar orders with other separated couples. The experience of marriage for elite wives during the Elizabethan period was dependent on many factors. The expectation of the period meant that there may have been a great deal of pressure to behave in a certain manner, and the position wives held resembled a career, meaning they experienced responsibility and some independence within the home and estate. The understanding of women as inferior underpinned much of their experience, but it also contradicted it. When individual cases are considered, incidences of intelligence, organisation and dedication emerge, suggesting that these wives understood their own capabilities, even if Elizabethan writers did not. Despite the oppressive stance of the conduct literature, Women were entrusted with responsibilities by their husbands, which contradicts what was communicated to men regarding female ineptitude. In this way, it may be the actual experience of marriage for an elite woman was more positive, albeit demanding, than contemporary literature would have us consider possible. Various elements within the marriage could determine whether it was a positive or negative experience, as a somewhat separate issue whether the marriage was successful. The most positive experience for elite wives such as Barbara Sidney's and Bess's marriage to William St. Lowe appears to have been when there was a presence of affection and support, an unease at separation, and concern over well-being. A shift in attitudes propelled by Puritanism means that affection was considered with some importance as being necessary for a marriage that was not only in name. While affection certainly does seem to have been present in some marriages and may have contributed to contentment, it didn't necessarily equate to success in the way that wealth, connection and lineage did. In marriages such as Margaret and Thomas Hoby, an example of an enduring marriage with a virtuous and subservient wife, and Bess's dysfunctional marriage to George Talbot based on amalgamation of assets, the absence of feeling is evident. Grace and Anthony Mildmay, forced together regardless of feeling, provide evidence of an unhappy marriage despite the impeccable character of a Christian wife and the creation of ties and lineage. The impact of motherhood on the experience of marriage could also be considered, and whether in particular the creation of a lineage or dynasty were determining factors in success and happiness. While this is a complex question, it could be observed that the happiest, most successful marriage here was that of Barbara and Robert Sidney, who created a large lineage and displayed very little dysfunction or unhappiness. Bess, however, whose children resulted from her second marriage, provided evidence of both happy and dysfunctional marriages, suggesting that the factor of children in marital success and happiness is a complicated one. While the experience of marriage for elite women was clearly influenced by several variables, and largely these were out of their control, if they were able to maintain their virtue and embrace virtuous industry, this may have allowed them to create their own experience, bolstered if possible by affection and support. Was this experience, however, unrelated to its success? Bess, who experienced affection and abuse, wealth, connection, lineage and dysfunction, ultimately lived through 4 successful marriages, leaving her an extremely wealthy and influential widow. In the Elizabethan period, science defined wives as inferior, weaker vessels, so fragile and in need of management and protection they could only exist as an extension of their husband. In the 21st century, we're encouraged to think differently, yet the gender prejudice remains in place for many. Just as today, it's likely that a financially successful marriage and a happy marriage were separate goals, and the achievement of both was the exception rather than the rule. Thank you so much for watching this talk. I really hope you have enjoyed it. You can find me in all of these different places if you don't already, and keep your eye out. I very much hope there'll be more talks like this to come. Thank you and bye.